Well, welcome again to another episode of TIO Talks. My name is Warwick Powell. Today I'm joined by Chandran Nair. Chandran is the founder of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, an independent think tank based in Hong Kong. Chandran is also a published author and has recently published a book called Understanding China: Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence, under the banner of Routledge, a reputable international publishing house. Welcome to the show, Chandran.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Pleasure to be with you.
Look, it's great to have you here. And the publication of this book, I think, is very timely. Discussions about China's economic development experiences over the last 40 years and also in the last few years has certainly grabbed public attention around the world. And your book, I think, provides some important, unique, and nuanced perspectives on that experience. Perhaps you could just let our viewers know a little bit about yourself and what brought you firstly to writing this particular book before we dive into the book itself.
Sure. I'm a Malaysian citizen. I've lived in Hong Kong for about 30 years. And I went to China when China was very much at the start of the revolution, the economic political revolution that we've seen. So I remember China where I went to Beijing in 1990 for the first time. I stayed at the Beijing Hotel in Tiananmen Square, and it was a very, very different place. There was no central heating. You didn't get a key to your room, and everyone wore mouse suits. I bought one. I still have it. The old stuff, and I've had the pleasure as a Malaysian of Indian descent, etc., of working in Hong Kong and traveling to China, hundreds of times all across the country and seeing what happened. And so, before that, I lived in Africa for a few years, and I was very much involved with the development issues there and even the liberation struggle. So for me, it was contextual to see, and thus I became a keen observer. I'm not an academic, but a keen observer of development and the sort of political economy. And I had firsthand experience with China, and I thought I should share it more with people and give people an idea. Given, as you've said earlier, there's so much talk about China, but it's extremes. It's either hypercritical or faithfully sort of praising China. And I thought, let's try and see if we could provide some insights based on my lived experience, as well as I should say that with my colleagues at the Club of Rome, China. So the founding members of four of us, and we thought that one European, an American, one Chinese, and myself. And I came up with the idea that we should at least write this book. And so I took on the task of writing it. That's why my name is prominent, but the other three are also acknowledged as advisors on the book. So that was the motivation. That's a bit about me. And I ran the largest consulting firm on sustainability and environment for about 20 years throughout Asia. And I'm very pleased that I opened the first environmental sustainability consultancy in China in 1994, I believe.
Yeah, they were early days indeed.
That's right.
We might touch on some of the environmental dimensions of China's growth experiences, which has, of course, really come to the fore in the last 10 years
Yes.
or so. But before we get there, in terms of this new book, which we'll have links to, of course, in the video description below, what's the main thesis, if you will, of the book, and what I guess are the particular aspects of your take on China's economic development experience which you'd like to draw readers' attention to?
Yeah, I'd like to first say that the driver for the book, I mentioned it in my little introduction there, was to write a book that does not seek to simply criticize China. We've seen a lot of that, or overtly simply say China is perfect. That it's much more complex than that. So the book does neither. Because it does not seek to criticize China, all the usual criticisms that we've all seen. Some will see it as pro China, and we were very keen. I was very keen to make sure that the book does not come across as pro or anti, because that would miss the point. So the book lays out the sort of issues, that the facts and the observations from my extensive, experience and my colleagues from the Club of Rome China, and allowing the reader to decide. So the it does not seek to persuade you to like or dislike China. It persuades you to have an open mind, examine the facts, the analysis, the observations, and come to your own conclusions. And the hope is that it will be help people. And I'm particularly interested in the younger generation. This is not simply a book written for the chattering classes of pseudo intellectuals and all who want to discuss China in almost abstract terms. So there is a deliberate attempt here to make the book very readable, easy to access, and to get people to appreciate that most of what we understand about China coming from the sort of mainstream is not I don't want to say inaccurate, but oversimplifies as reductionist, etc. And you need to look at it very carefully. So the main sort of thesis of the book is to allow people to understand that the shifts in China essentially were a deep rooted sort of political philosophy that posed all the difficulties that China had in the 70s and 80s, post revolution, etc., the cultural revolution, etc., was a profound understanding within that of how to shift the country towards where it is and to lay that out. So, if you'll give me a minute, I'll just say that the book is divided into five sections. The first one is and it doesn't look at the history going back 100 years. It just looks at from the Deng Xiaoping era to the current. So it talks about China's rise, the economic and political ascent of China, and tries to simplify it so people really understand. Then it looks at a bulk of the book is about China, the present. And as you know better than I do, things shift almost weekly given the geopolitics and the complexity of China. But it looks at the present, strengths and weaknesses, and there it looks at four areas that I thought most people would be interested in, and that is the economy, the economics of how the political economy is structured, the domestic and global politics, but they're both very interrelated. The issue of military, which everyone in the world sort of interested, are they going to be a hegemonic military power, and actually some of the numbers on the military spending and all of that. And finally, it looks at civil society because there again, a lot of people think that China doesn't have an active civil society. It has a very active society, civil society. It is different from the Western liberal notion of what a civil society is, and it goes and describes that. Then there's a section on governance in China. How does it govern? What does the governance system look like? Here again, to dispel some of the mythology that it's a bunch of 8 or 9 people in Beijing who control the whole country, and it's actually a lot more complex than that. There's numerous checks and balances and how all of that works. And then the final two chapters, it looks at China's today a powerful nation. Everyone is talking about China. They have different views. So is China a force for good for the world, or is it not? And we try and outline the benefits of China's rise over the last 30 years, some of the setbacks, and some of the challenges it has, particularly in relation to also some of the expectations that China should step up in terms of intervening in the sort of genocide in Gaza. Why doesn't it take a more proactive role? And we talk about a bit about that. And finally, China and the world in terms of its international image and its relations with the rest of the world, both the existing Western powers, the United States, but also very importantly, the rest of the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So that's what the book is, how the book is structured and divided.
You've jammed a lot of issues and information into 174 pages, and perhaps we could just dive into each of those. Now, I'm going to be a little bit contrarian. I'm going to work in the reverse order to what you've outlined. We normally cover a lot of economic issues, but I'm particularly interested in your perspectives on governance and civil society to start with, and perhaps you could just outline what your broad sense is of China's governance model, not the nine wise men sitting in Beijing, but a richer, more complex institutional environment. That's the first one. And secondly, how that interacts with this general idea of civil society, which I might add is actually a very Western notion. And as you have already suggested, China's civil society, or civil society with Chinese characteristics, should not be misconstrued for civil society in a Western sense. So, governance and civil society from Chandran Nair's point of view, please.
Thank you, Professor Warwick. I'll try and answer that question by referring very quickly to the outline early in the book that describes the factors that drove China's rise, because that is governance. It is about society, and it's civil society, as you say, very different from the concept of civil society from the sort of the Western lens. So it outlines six factors for the rise, and then I'll get to the issue of the governance. And the main thing in the terms of the governance was that China's rise was linked to the government taking a very proactive role in a productivity-centered economic reforms. I think you know that. So, but that required interactions with so many aspects of society. And I particularly remember when one of my first assignments was to go to Shanghai, when one of the largest U.S. multinationals was buying out one of the state-owned enterprises, and there were 60,000 people in that state-owned enterprise, a school, and all of those. And so all the sort of governance issues and the reforms that were needed. So it focused on productivity. And secondly, then the governance is very clear, and this comes back to the people and society, was that needs to be an intense investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure, as you know, not simply for businesses and ports, etc., but a whole host of infrastructure. I've had the privilege of going to some of the poorest parts of China. I have very good friends living amongst the ethnic minorities communities and in Gansu province, minority Muslims, Tibetans, and of course many Chinese friends. And I could see the transformation, and that's essentially something I wanted to share in this book as well. So intense investment in infrastructure, down to, as we all now know, sanitation, toilets, water supply, and all of that, which I think started to involve in the way, and the way it was done was to involve society, and that's what I call the civil society engagement approach. And then a very interesting emphasis on strategic and intense tech research to bolster the confidence of the institutions, but also society at large. And you know as well as I know that technology, and there is a risk, we all know this, has spread in China into areas. And because I go to some of the remote areas, I am surprised at how technology has permeated. But this is also the engagement with the society, with the checks and balances, etc. But coming to your point about governance, it is distinctively communitarian. And that, I think, is not understood enough. Many people think that dictates. And I can give a lot of examples, which I don't go into the book, but I hope in talks, etc., about how this distinctively communitarian approach, which was essentially elevated by President Xi when he came in. He emboldened essentially communities so far from Beijing to essentially become the eyes and guard stewards of better governance in far-flung parts of the country. And I know people who were stripped of their land by corrupt officials in over the last 30 years who got their land back, who were compensated, and all of those things. I know government officials who had built large buildings in rural areas, who were then sent to prison for misuse of public funds and all of those. So it's very communitarian, and you know the details of the poverty alleviation process, which essentially went down to every household in every village in every mountain in every valley in China, and was all digitized as well. And it was all about the collective civil society, and that I saw firsthand and noticed how even infrastructure in parts were built by society working on it rather than the government dictating. And then long term political planning with the focus on the stability at all costs. And I'll give one example, if you don't mind. When I first went to the Tibetan areas, it was when there were quite a few incidents of Tibetan monks uh, setting themselves on fire and all of that. This was about 12, 13 years ago. And I went in, and I remember once I was not allowed in. And the Chinese, my Tibetan friends told me, we can't go in today, but we can go in tomorrow. And I went in, and I remember seeing it was a festival, lots of military presence in a small Tibetan monastery town, which is one of the most sacred, by the way, in the entire Tibetan world outside of Lhasa. I came back the following year, and President Xi had come in, and I noticed that all the military presence was removed. So I asked my Tibetan friends what happened, and they said, well, the government said that the monasteries should be able to take care of themselves, that the military doesn't need to be here. And if the military is here in this sort of, hard presence of soldiers in uniforms, it actually degrades the unity of the society. And I can tell you, since then, I've not seen any military presence. I go there every year, and it has changed. And I even see pictures of the Dalai Lama in people's homes and things like that. So that's an understanding that we want people also to have. So there's a very collective civil society, but it's not how we understand civil society in the Western context as well. And lastly, I would say effective population management policies. And I'm not just talking about the one child, one policy. And finally, in terms of the governance issue, Professor Powell, if I might add, a very determined focus not to overreach on foreign policy adventures, which comes back to my earlier point about some of us feeling China should do something about Gaza. So that's the kind of the governance kind of overall architecture that we try to reference in the book. But I hope also addresses your question that it was very communitarian. And now to the point about the governance, there's a whole chapter on it. And I talk about, again, I'm thinking about the 28-year-old sitting in Australia, the US, my country, Malaysia, India, and think, what is this place, China? How do they govern? And so we talk about the five tiers of governance in China. As you know, it's the village. I've sat in village meetings where party heads have been yelled at and told to leave because they didn't fulfill certain obligations. There's no military presence, nothing like that. So this village, this is not to say, and I want to be careful, that there isn't corruption or things like that, but it's really diminished. But the power of the communities to challenge officials, I have seen numerous times. And as an organization, the Global Institute, we run programs throughout China, both on social and economic issues, and we are always welcomed by either the towns, the city officials, and mayors. So you have the village, then you have the township, and townships in China can be a million and over. And then you have the municipalities, some of which are 5 to 10 million. And then you have the provinces, and then you have the central state. So we talk about how that whole system works, the checks and balances, and the rigorous amount of institutional engagement and support. And I don't want to be critical of India, other countries, but you don't find the same level of engagement at the working level, at the daily level, at the implementation level. And I think that's really important. And finally, I'll say that when I first went to China, you meet heads of a municipality, etc. They were typically old boys, smoking cigarettes and wearing the whole mouse suits and stuff like that. And today, I always say that I've been recently, just in the last couple of years, I've been to small towns that most people have never heard of, with populations of two small towns, I should say small in Chinese sense, but 2 to 3 million people. And you meet the mayor, and she's a 41-year-old woman with a first degree in civil engineering and a PhD in economics. And then you meet the deputy mayor, a 40-year-old young man with engineering degree, and perhaps I met one with a first degree in English and linguistics and a PhD in economics. So you find a system where the governance is essentially very much based on meritocracy and competence, and there's an intolerance for lack of competence and not being good enough to do the job. So I hope that sort of gives you a flavor of what the system of governance. But to your point, and I know I'm taking a bit of time, but on civil society, this has been one of the most interesting things I found out. I know, and in fact, one of the founding members of the Club of Rome China is a well-known academic, but who also is heads up, with the approval of the government, which is typically the case in China, a large umbrella organization of civil society groups, particularly focused on biodiversity and conservation. And I was shocked when I invited him to Hong Kong a few years ago to speak to a group of leaders from across the world about how active his organization had been in suing large Chinese government entities and state-owned enterprises for breaching what they saw as environmental laws, sustainability laws, and the social contract. And they had won in courts as well. So I think civil society is very different. It's organized very differently. And there's a great deal of student activity. But as you and I know, it should be always managed without essentially resorting to violence or criticism that, we can argue is not how the Chinese government should operate, but criticism that seeks to undermine the role of the state and create unrest. And that seems to be the guardrails for how civil society operates.
That last example you touched on, I think, really opens up a very interesting window into one of the most prominent aspects of the recent years of economic development and emphasis, and that is the ways in which economic development and ecological development or conservation have become much more integrated. Part of China's industrialization and modernization journey, particularly in the first few decades after the death of Chairman Mao, of course, saw heavy industry and light industry come on board. And we can all remember the days when the larger cities in particular were heavily polluted. I'd be interested in your perspectives, given that you've been engaged in this broad ecological environmental arena for, should I say, 31
Yes.
years. Um, uh, how that window, together with your perceptive observations about civil society, are now being articulated into an economic development trajectory that is, in a sense, opening up a new frontier, shall we say, of social, economic, and ecological development.
Thank you, thank you. That's it's a very interesting and a topic I could spend a long time speaking about, but I'll keep it short. When I first went to China in the 1990s, already having been involved in early 1990s, already heading up the region's largest consulting firm at a time where there was so little interest, not just across Asia, but particularly in China. I at that point I didn't know what I know now, in both in terms of my awareness of the drivers of ecological destruction, environmental pollution. But I come from a technical background. I'm a bioscience, biotech, biochemical engineer by training. and I've done a lot of work in water and then the issues of policy. I thought, my God, this is going to take 100 years. Clearly, I was not as informed as I am today, but we also didn't understand how technology would advance. But what really has happened in China is not technological as the main thing that drove it. It was essentially an extremely deep appreciation, in my view, that if they carried on, they had to develop. But if they didn't put in place clear policies at different stages that managed this, that China would essentially cave in terms of the high costs. I don't think there's anyone in China in the higher levels who does not acknowledge a high price was paid. I think they understand this. But because such a high price was paid in the early days and before, when there was just no ability to deal with all of these things, they're determined that the current generation and next generation and those to follow will not suffer the same. And because China is so large, it learned lessons that I argue that other countries could not learn. So, there's not much that, I'm I'm often irritated when small nations in Europe and turn up in China to or in Asia generally to sort of teach them how to do things because the scale is so different, as you will know. So what happened is visionary leaders in the 90s began to see what the next 30, 40 years needs to look like because you're not going to change this overnight. People like me thought it would take a century, but essentially it took about 25 years to change things. And that, I think, comes back to two things. First, the governance system that allows for long term views. And you will know that, in the run up to the Beijing Olympics, I was acutely involved in all the multinationals going in there and asking questions, etc. The Chinese government at that stage has still not really used foreign consultants. We had an office there, my firm, but we were doing mainly work for not for multinationals. And then I had the pleasure of meeting the then head of the Ministry for Environment. It was called by a different name. He became the chief climate negotiator for China, an international figure who retired 2 years ago. And I remember very distinctly him asking me, your firm is one of the leading environmental sustainability consultants in the world. What's all the stuff about the circular economy? We don't know much about it. Can you give me as much information as you can? So, somewhere in China, where they were dealing with the most basic things about water pollution, toxins in the air, and all of those hazardous waste, etc., there were policymakers thinking way ahead. Even in my firm, which is one of the leading in the world, we don't have much material because in our companies in the US and Europe, it was still very much a theoretical framework. I put together a lot of material and I gave it to him. And today we see that China, and I'm not saying we necessarily initiated that because there's lots of other institutions in China were looking into it. They have created their own model. I would say, in terms of looking at the circular economy, in terms of scale and impact, China is the world leader today. But it also required China to bring along its populace. So I'll go back to uh, the small towns that I go to in Gansu province and also through our institution throughout China, from Qinghai to Hebei, etc. 25 years ago, these were dirty, polluted, dusty. Today, I would say 95% of them have been transformed. Not transformed into okay places, but transformed into almost idyllic sort of representations of what we think a small town should look like in terms of water, sanitation, air quality, access to energy, and even now, very strict controls on the disposal of plastics. And all of this, as someone who's worked with policy in different parts of the world, It's very difficult to do in any country. And you cannot do it simply by imposing orders. You need the buy-in of the citizens. And I come back to the sort of communitarian approach, and that requires large-scale education. So I'll go to some of the schools in the provinces where the majority of kids are from the minority ethnic groups, 50-50, Han Chinese, Muslims from the minority groups, and the Tibetans. And I walk into the classes because I have access with some friends, and there's always classes about civic behavior, teaching 7, 8 year olds about pollution and all of that. So I think this is multi level. I started by saying it's vision, thinking ahead, political system that allows a policy maker like the minister to think 40 years ahead. And then initiating the short term things that need to be done. I think you will know that scores of large industrial sites around Beijing were moved before the Olympics and continued. I remember going to Shanghai in 1997, and it was so dusty. There were industrial sites right in the middle of the city, etc. And within the space of 5 years, all of this had been moved. So it takes what I argue, as you probably know in my second book, The Sustainable State, for the state to intervene because of scale, but there's the same state, same at the same level, the state to have legitimacy and the buy-in of society to enable those changes because society benefits from it. And that's how I see the civil society movement in China actually working hand in hand with the state. And in areas where the state has let the people down, as I've seen in certain areas, I've seen lots of people at the community level protest and the state respond. Not all the times, but a lot of the time. So that I think has been the interesting thing. And the last point I'll add to that is because China has done that on scale, it has essentially been allowed to build its know-how and technology on scale and become an economic powerhouse in exporting its, if you want to call it, green technology. And that's not just simply in terms of EV, but on a whole host of other things. I mean, we all know about the solar, the wind turbines, but there's also some very other interesting areas where optimization of energy systems, etc., and looking at using digital technology to optimize. You can use big data, AI, etc., to really optimize operations from a mine right through to monitoring discharges, emissions of all kinds in real time. And that's where Chinese technology has moved so far ahead. What's also interesting is it's exported it into Africa, it made it available in Latin America, Indonesia, etc. One last point I'll make is one of the organizations that transformed the reporting of environmental data was actually an NGO in China, led by a Chinese gentleman who created that, and he created the first digital real-time monitoring of air pollution. And civil society and embarrassing large companies or any company that was emitting pollution and showing the data. The Chinese government went as far as to encourage him and made it nationwide. Today, it's one of the best, I think, cited examples of civil society groups working together with the government and in a developing country of that state. That was about 15 years ago to create one of the most advanced real-time tracking of air pollutants from industrial sites.
It's a fascinating journey. It really brings me, I guess, to the last bracket, given our time and your precious time that I don't want to use up too much
I've
of.
got time for you always, Professor
And that
Powell.
is to, in a sense, extend from that discussion to explore that question that you asked towards the end of the book, which is China a force for good? And when people often talk about China on the international stage, of course, a lot of the discussion has turned to things like its military power, its sort of general economic heft. Some would go to a point of arguing things like China is now has surplus capacity or excess capacity, etc., etc. But the tenor of the discussion that we've had here today leads me to think a lot more about China and its, uh, I don't like using the word model, but its sort of broad approach, which is to look at problems holistically and understand that you can have as many visions as you want, but unless you get buy-in at the operational level, the vision is difficult to implement. But importantly, how at the heart of all of these things is a recognition that unless you uplift the capacity of people, knowledge, know-how, etc., you can have the best laid plans and they will never come to fruition. Perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit more on that question of people, capacity building, and whether China is a force for good within that context.
No, thank you very much. As you know, we run these series of virtual conferences. You've been a distinguished guest on one of our panels, and last 2 weeks ago we had another one. And I think one of the things that we try to get a curated panel from different parts of the world is to get a global audience to understand that it's not propaganda, it's not simply a slogan, there is actually substance. It's ideological, if I can't even use that word in China. This belief in what has, President Xi and others have spoken about, which is the community of shared future for humanity or mankind. That is something that the more cynical of us say, yeah, it's all good stuff, but nobody actually believes in this stuff. It's real politics and zero sum game, and we've all been. Those arguments have almost been normalized. We've been inured to not thinking that there can be this vision, and you know that in 2017 the Chinese government came out and talked about a world of common prosperity. And again, then the business community and others were dismissive of it. But today, as the existential threats have begun to converge, most people understand there is something here. So to your point about the how China sees its role in the world, is it a force for good and people? I think all of us who know China and what the book tries to explain is there's still a lot of people in China who are poor, but extreme poverty has been eradicated, and that's the Chinese version, and the World Bank and other international institutions agree that extreme poverty has been eradicated. The basic rights to life, which I consider, which I list as essentially food, safe and secure, which is a big issue for China given its history. Those things, water, sanitation, some of the highest levels of access anywhere in the world. I go to rural parts of China 25 years ago. You don't want to have belly ache and go to one of those toilets. And today, these toilets are first class. You can smell the Dettol about 20 meters from even before you enter in rural areas, these toilets. So then you have access to electricity, some of the highest in the world again, education, healthcare, and those things. And so I think China has achieved that, and it's got a lot more to do. But what has been really interesting for me is China's approach now to taking its experience, but not its model. It's very important that we make this point in the book. The Chinese don't believe their model can be exported, and they have no interest. As one Chinese politician told me cheekily, people think we are interested in exporting our model. It will not work elsewhere. But let me also say, he said, that if we got such a good model, why would we export it? We want to keep it for ourselves. So they don't believe their model can be exported and they're not interested in it. But what I think they are interested, given this framework of the community of shared future for humanity, for mankind, is to make sure that other countries can benefit from their rise, their know-how, and to share. And in our last virtual conference last week, 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, where we talked about China's role with regard to the creation of prosperity, etc., and development, and its political role as well. We had two or three Chinese speakers, one from China, two based outside, and all three of them were very clear that China believes in development as peace. And I'm sure you know this much better than me, that the best way to create peace is to help countries essentially rise through economic development and understanding the trade-offs. But development is peace is the main focus, and we talk about that in the book as well. So I would say that, to your point about whether China's how China is doing that, it has a commitment to the rest of the world. It sees development as peace, and it wants to invest in that. At the same time, we should not think that other countries aren't concerned. And and what some of the things I try and do, and I've said this very openly in forums where I have colleagues, I have Chinese officials present, and they've appreciated, is that China needs to understand that it's so big that as it rises and it needs for resources, etc., it should tread very carefully. Because you're so big, it's easy to trample on others. And again, the understanding that the view that some people have that every time there is a misbehavior of a Chinese entity in Cambodia or Indonesia or somewhere in Africa, oh, it must be those communists in Beijing and those nasty Politburo people who said, go and do this thing in China, in Africa, etc. And I can give you an example. So where we have, through the Club of Rome China, written letters to the highest levels, because members of the Club of Rome in Africa have cited incursions into sensitive areas in Africa by Chinese companies. But you, as an Australian, would know it's not just Chinese companies that do this. Australian companies, American companies, mining companies have done this for decades and still continue to do that. But somehow it's seen as China. So, as a force for good, I think overall we cite a couple of things. It played that role at a critical time and became the factory to and for the world. We all got cheaper goods, etc. But it also paid a heavy price because it's part of a global supply chain that externalized the cost, and that externalization of cost was felt in China: pollution, cheap labor, etc. Clearly, it's a force for good. It's the world's largest consumer market for many global brands. If I put on my other hat about overconsumption, I would see that as having some major problems as well. And I think the Chinese need to grapple with that problem and understand that. It's a vital source, increasingly, of development aid, trade, and capital for developing countries. We've seen that with the creation of the AIB, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, etc., and increasingly becoming a constructive player for global governance. As someone who observes this, and you are the expert on this, 5 years ago, I don't think many countries took China that seriously, particularly in the West. Today, although there is still a sort of China bias, I think China's role is becoming accepted. That's what the book tries to say. Look at these things and look at the shifts that are taking place. The new China Global Governance Initiative, I think, is an important one, and I'd like to see more discussions about that, and the Chinese explain that more. So that's also a contribution. And lastly, I think it's fair to say that China has become an engine for technological and scientific research across the world, which is a good thing. I was at a tech conference, closed door, all Chinese companies, AI discussions. I was privileged to be there. It was all held in Chinese, but I had an interpreter, and they were talking about AI. And my host asked me to ask a question, and I asked them what I thought was a slightly philosophical question about the role of AI and essentially how it was a threat to human societies on many levels. And typically, if you go to a tech conference like this in the US or in Europe, etc., firstly, I don't get invited. Secondly, you don't get to ask a question. And if you do ask a question, you're seen as an irritant and the question is dismissed. I was amazed to see these tech people get into a deeply philosophical discussion about the role of AI, the limitations and the dangers. And so I said to them, will the Chinese government be the first government that highly regulates AI? And most of them said, of course, it will be the one that could bring that. So I think when China starts to regulate AI and finds what the boundaries are, as powerful as it can be, then that too becomes a public good because many of our countries, smaller countries, we're just taking the stuff in. We don't have control on it. And I think these policy frameworks are needed. I don't think they are going to come from the USA. I think Europe's doing a bit, but again, that could be a public good. So I think those are the main things that I see as the a force for good. China being a force for good, but it has many challenges that it'll have to confront. Overreach, I think, is one. I have told the Chinese that they need to be really careful, for instance, about Chinese fleets fishing on the off the east coast of Africa and depleting fish stocks, mining all of those. So I think one of the good things I'll finally say about China is if they get this message, the Chinese don't dismiss it. That's been my experience. They listen and they listen to friends and they've listened to the West for years on environmental issues. They created an environmental and development council, some of the most internationally respected environmental experts from around the world would always come to China and meet the premier and the president to take advice. And so on these issues, they do listen, take advice, and always willing to learn. And I think that's a good thing. And of course, the other challenge is continuing to curtail corruption, which the Chinese openly acknowledge and President Xi put on the front table and said, we don't deal with this. So I think that's a force for good requires it to also be an example. And I can tell you, I'm a Malaysian citizen. I work in Hong Kong. And the amount of times when I speak in Malaysia, the amount of Malaysians who say, and I'm not here to in any way besmirch the reputation of my country, but we have severe problems. And they've asked me, what do they do in China? And I say, well, they act very firmly. And some of the measures I would not recommend for my own country, but a firm hand. And so they continue in that sense to, I think, set an example. And I mention that because I think the rest of Asia is looking at China in terms of the fight against corruption. And I know my own country, people are saying, why don't we use that example? Maybe not the extreme versions of punishment, and also very interestingly, the efficiencies. And this is another lesson that we in Asia, and particularly in Southeast Asia, are looking to the Chinese and saying, my God, they're efficient. And I'll finish by saying I think the deputy minister in Malaysia yesterday, speaking in Beijing to several hundred Malaysian students, said, please learn from this system, which is unusual in Malaysia to acknowledge the Chinese system. Learn from this system and learn the work ethic and the efficiencies. So I think in that way, China is the intangible spreading of goodwill is also coming from being an exemplifier of how you should organize. And then we should learn from China's mistakes too. And the Chinese will be the best students, I believe, of their own mistakes as well.
Look, China's rise has been central to the changes that we've been experiencing and observing as we head into the latter half of the second decade of the 21st century. Chandran Nair, thanks so much for joining us and sharing with us your insights, drawing on your recent publication. I'd recommend our viewers to get their hands on the book and absorb it and learn lessons from it, both good and bad. So it's been great to have you, and I look forward to having you back on again.
Professor Powell, can I just say one thing for the readers at the end to go away
By all
with?
means.
Yeah, in terms of understanding the book. The book was written to make five clear points, and I'll make this very brief, that there is more in common that China has with other countries, including the West, that separates them. This is so important point that we try to make. It's not this mysterious place that's doing all these funny things. There's actually much more in common. The same struggles, civil society, people have aspirations, politics, economics. Second, the new China is crossing the river while feeding the stones, old Chinese story, and especially in geopolitics. Never expected to be this place. Never expected that so many countries, smaller, say, "Hey, China, what are you going to do? How are you going to lead this?" So I think it's crossing the river whilst feeding the stones. And if they are to work together, it requires China and the West to see the world through the lens of the other. This is really important. This is what we say. We need China, and particularly the United States, to work together. And if they are to work together and be of benefit to the rest of the world, then they need to see the world through the lens of the others. Final 2 points. We should be very clear that China should not be viewed as a state waiting, wanting, or needing to be like the West. And you know that this is an unfortunate misconception that has been widely held. And one of the things that the book says is the West has its merits, China has its merits and weaknesses, but please do not expect China as an ancient civilization to be viewed as, and don't view it as a state wanting or needing to be like the West. And the last point, there is no China model as such. There are different models even within China. There's a lot of diversity in implementation and policies. There are much more qualified Chinese who can talk to you about that. But there is no China model, and China is not seeking to export its model, which is what we try and get across in the book as well. So thank you for giving me those few extra minutes.
Fantastic summary. 5 key points, folks. Take it on board, and I guess learn more about China as a way of learning more about ourselves.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.